Well, good morning, and thanks so much for that reading. For those of you who may be new or visiting this live stream, my name's Jitesh, one of the ministers here. It's a great joy just to share a few words with you now. And we're carrying on a series that we began last Sunday as a new series, looking at having an open life in lockdown, that even though we might still be in lockdown, Jesus isn't. That he's at work in the world and that he's calling us to join in with what he's doing in people's lives. And it was so helpfully introduced to us by the bishop last week. That was a great privilege to have him share a few words. And we looked at how we can have the heart of Jesus for the lost, how he yearns for the lost to be saved, and how that should be our yearning as well. But today I want to look at very simply and very practically what we can do to connect with people around us, to share that message of Jesus, to make a connection that they might experience Jesus as well. I'm aware that my experience of sharing about evangelism or sharing the faith is that people have one of two reactions to the idea. The first one is one of real excitement. This is a great adventure and joy to be on, that we get to see what Jesus might do in and through us and winning people for himself. But another reaction often can be one of inadequacy, a feeling of inadequacy, of fear, even of failure. That often we just feel that we don't have the words or don't know what to do. That anything that we do or say might actually just make things worse for people coming to know Jesus. And actually we feel frustrated and a failure, that we long to make Jesus known and we just haven't been able to. And I want to address those things by taking a step back and returning back to the basics, really, and look at a couple of really simple steps. In those well-known words, it's really good to start at the very beginning, because it's a very good place to start. And so we're going to look at two things that we can do. And the first thing is this, that we can start with people that we know, and that we're called to start with people that we know. You see, in our passage, we find three mini stories of people witnessing to Jesus, to people that they already know. So we find John the Baptist at the beginning of the passage, who's already known that Jesus is the Messiah through his baptism and seeing the Spirit come upon him. He points to Jesus, says, "Look, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." And immediately two of his disciples go and follow Jesus that very instant. And then in the second story, we find that one of those two disciples is called Andrew. And he goes and finds his brother, Peter, and invites him to come and find out about Jesus. And then in that last story in the passage, there's Philip, who Jesus calls to himself. And Philip immediately goes to his brother Nathanael and says, "I found him. I found the Messiah. He's come. Come and find out." In each one of those stories, the one consistent thing through them all is that people speak to people they already know. And they make Jesus known to those who they are already in relationship with. And it's almost like in those events, that's the most important thing, that things are being pre-arranged in advance in the relationships that they have, so that when Jesus comes onto the scene, immediately the message of him spreads like wildfire, almost like dominoes that have been arranged that then suddenly all cascade and fall. And it's important to realise that what happened in this passage, and what happens so often in our lives, isn't haphazard evangelism. But in God's sovereignty, the relationships that they have and that we have are in place according to God's purpose and plan in advance. The Apostle Paul says in Acts 17, "From one man God made every nation, that they should inhabit the world, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. That all the places that we live, the people that we know in those places, have been set in advance according to God's plan." You know that in the Old Testament we find that story of Esther, that young Jewish girl who is forced into a marriage with the king of Persia, a relationship that really doesn't seem to be of God. But then when push comes to shove, people, and especially her uncle Mordecai, realizes actually this is exactly the relationship that God intended in advance, that he put Esther in the place of royal position. And he says, "Who knows whether you've come to royal position for such a time as this, for the saving of many." That it wasn't accidental, that it was from God for that particular time that it would bring about salvation. And that's so true so often of the relationships that we have. They're not accidental. They have God's timing, they have God's purpose for the salvation of many. You see, the Bible talks about God redeeming all creation, that God has a master plan for the entirety of creation to be saved. And that's a huge plan, that's a complex plan that involves putting the right people in the right places at the right times, so that Jesus, through those people, can be known. Almost like a chess grandmaster who thinks 10 moves in advance, he puts us in places and relationships with people according to his sovereign purpose in advance, so that salvation can spread to many. It's really interesting that in a recent in-depth analytical survey of attitudes towards Christians in this nation, it was found that 67% of the population already knew an active, committed Christian. 67%, that's over 2/3. That God really does have a plan for the nation, and he's already put it into place. It's us and the people that we already know. Therefore, none of the people that we know are people we know by accident. Certainly not our family, that's not accidental. Our friends aren't an accident. Our work colleagues, our neighbours, the people that we meet in day-to-day life that we form relationships with, it's not accidental. God has put those things on purpose in our lives according to his sovereign plan, that he might make Jesus known through us. And we're to do that. We're to join in with what he's already done in our lives. Many of us will know that often the testimony of people that come to know Jesus isn't that they had a vision from heaven or dream at night, or necessarily actually that they experienced the miraculous that led them to Jesus. Actually, the testimony of so many is that it was through people they knew already, that was what made all the difference. And we're to realise that we're part of that plan that God has put into place in advance. It's really interesting that in our passage, a number of these disciples end up being amongst the apostles, sent out to the ends of the earth. They would make known Jesus to people they'd never met before, people and cultures that they'd never experienced. But in our passage here, they start with people they know. We know Andrew, for example, made it all the way to modern-day Russia with the gospel. But what does he do here? He starts with his brother. He starts with Peter. And for us, I don't think that God calls us to go overseas to make Jesus known. I don't think he asks us to make Jesus known in the wider community before we first started with the people that we know. It's interesting that a few years ago, the Lord really brought this home to me. I was due to go on a long-haul flight on holiday that would last 10 hours. It was to the United States. And I thought, well, that's great. I'm going to be sat next to one person I know on the trip out for the duration of that flight, 10 whole hours, and they're not going to be able to get away from me. And so I can really share the gospel with them. And I'd heard other people tell their stories of airport success and seeing people saved. And I said, I had faith. I wanted a story like that as well. So I started praying that God would lead me and would arrange the right person to sit next to me on that flight. And so that when that person sat down next to me, or I sat down next to them, I'd start a conversation. I knew how the conversation would go. It'd go along the lines of me asking what they did for a living. And when I found out what they did for a living, often the response is that they'd ask me what I did for a living. So they would ask me what I did, and I'd explain that I worked for a church. And that often leads into a deeper conversation about things of faith, and I could share Jesus with them. I had it all planned out. And so when the time of the flight came, I prayed, I sat down, and this woman sat down next to me. I thought, great, this is my opportunity, 10 hours, she can't get away, I'm going to share Jesus with her. So I started in my conversation. I asked, what do you do for a living? And guess what she said as a response? I work for a church. And when I just dug in, I found out she really was a Christian. She was an American Baptist Church children's pastor, the American equivalent of Alex Scott. And I was just utterly bemused. And later I ended up saying to the Lord, what was that? I prayed, I sought you, I was up for it, I was going to share the gospel. And yet you sit me down next to someone who's so clearly a Christian. I've not had that happen in a flight before. What's going on? And I felt the Lord slightly rebuke me in that moment and say to me, you want to make Jesus known to people that you've never met before, but you haven't done it with people you already know. There's so many who you already know that you haven't shared me with. Start with them. Start with them. And I really took that to heart, and I wonder for us, are there people that God has placed in our lives that we've never thought to share Jesus with? Perhaps people that we've overlooked, perhaps people that we've never thought would ever want to hear about him. But God's put those people in advance as part of his plan for them to be saved. And it hinges on us. It hinges on us taking that simple step of realization that we're to start with the people that we already know. Well, that was the first thing. And the second thing that I just want to share from this passage, another really simple step, is that we're to use the power of invitation in making Jesus known. You see, going back to our stories, at the heart of them is an invitation that is made to come and see, to experience who Jesus is firsthand. For Andrew and the other disciple, when they are pointed to Jesus by John the Baptist, they go up to Jesus and ask the question, Rabbi, where are you staying? And Jesus gives them an invitation. Come and you will see. And they're invited into Jesus' life and they get to spend the day with him. What an amazing invitation. And it solidifies their commitment and they become lifelong followers of him because they get to experience him through that invitation firsthand. We know that for Philip, when he goes up to his brother Nathaniel, who's skeptical, he seems to be a scholar and a thinker, and he rejects the idea of something good coming out of Nazareth, out of some kind of prejudice against northern towns. And Philip doesn't try and debate with him. He doesn't try and convince him by means of rational argumentation. Instead, he invites Nathaniel, doesn't he? He says, come and see. And he takes Nathaniel to Jesus. And as Nathaniel accepts that invitation, he meets with Jesus and that turns his life around. And it's never the same again. Yet, see, throughout this passage, the simple point is being made clear. Understand the power of invitation in the kingdom of God. That it's the primary door that God gives us for welcoming people into his kingdom. That it's the primary means that people come to know Jesus through. And it's still the same today. You see, we know that Jesus himself, in one sense, fundamentally, is God's invitation to us. That God, who dwelt in eternal glory, who is in perfection and didn't need a single thing, he's perfect in himself, but he invites us through sending his Son to us to come and experience his kingdom, to come and experience him and that perfection and to know him. Jesus is the living invitation from God to us. And we know that Jesus himself spoke of his kingdom being like invitation, that it's like a great wedding banquet. And the invitation has gone out to everyone, the highways and the byways, the entire countryside, and the towns and the cities and everything in between. The invitation's gone out, come into the kingdom and experience his joy. And that same power of invitation into his kingdom is what he puts into our hands. I think this is especially important in today's postmodern culture that, above all, I think values authenticity. The power of invitation to taste and see firsthand what Jesus is like. It has much more power than any rational, intellectual argumentation. The sheer joy of experiencing an invitation to experience the one who has invited us to come and know perfect and true and eternal life. I know from my own experience that when I became a Christian, it wasn't through any argumentation that I'd engaged in a lot of it with Christians. It was through invitation. It was through friends who plucked up the courage to invite me into a community that loved Jesus. They invited me into a place where Jesus was made known through their witness. And I encountered him in that place. And my life was turned around as a result. Just that simple power of invitation. And the great news about this is that making an invitation is a simple step that any of us can do. And the worst, as we often say, that people can do is to say no in response. I've told this story before and I'm going to tell it again because I just love it. And it's a story that happened a few years ago up in Edinburgh. And there was a businessman called Mr. Digby. And I'm not making this up, it's a true story. And he found himself on business in Edinburgh nearly every weekend throughout the years that he was involved in frequent flying as a salesman. And as a result, he was a passionate Christian. He got really frustrated because he just felt he had no means of sharing about Jesus because he was always away from home. And on top of that, he was a really shy person and really felt unable to witness to Jesus in simple conversations. And so praying about it and seeking God, he made a decision. He said that what I'm going to do is that every single Saturday night while I'm up in Edinburgh, I'm going to sit in the hotel bar. And then I'm going to invite one business person who sat there as well to come and join me at church the next morning. And so he started doing this. Every single weekend he was in Edinburgh, he invited someone to just come and join him. And sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. And he never knew what kind of fruit it was bearing until one week someone said during the service, "I've become a Christian." And utterly thrilled, Digby ran to the vicarage that was next door to the church with this person, and so knocked on the door and said to the vicar, "Look, this guy's just become a Christian. You've got to look after him." And the vicar looked at him and said, "Is your name Mr. Digby?" And he replied, "Yes, it is. Why is that?" Then the vicar went back into his house and got a large pile of letters and came back and he said this: "These are all the letters of all the people who have written to us over the years telling us how they'd come to follow Jesus. And they all started with the fact that someone called Mr. Digby had invited them to church. We didn't know who he was until now." Amazing story, the power of invitation. And I want to say to you, if you are watching and you have never been a follower of Jesus, you've yet to make that decision, then actually the reason we're so passionate about inviting you to come and know Jesus, the reason we are talking about these things is that he changes everything. That coming to know him is the best possible thing in life, and accepting that invitation is the best possible invitation you could ever accept. And I want to say that these words right now are our invitation to you to come and join us, to come and explore and find out about him personally. And for many of us watching, we've already accepted that invitation. And God places in our hands that same power that we once had, given to us an invitation that we can give to others. And when we invite people, it's not just to a course like Alpha, which is a great place to invite people to. It's not just to a building, it's not just to a Zoom service or a streaming service like this morning. The invitation that we're making is an invitation to come and meet with Jesus. A greater invitation that we could possibly give to people. And I believe that God's really calling us in this season to make the most of that power we've been given, the power of invitation. So who are you going to invite?